Paul Cheshire is Professor Emeritus of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics and an Associate at the Centre for Economic Performance. His research has focused on urban growth in Europe, urban land and housing markets, and the economic effects of land use planning. He's the author-editor of 12 books and more than 150 journal articles. He has acted as consultant to governments and international organizations. These include the World Bank, the UN, the OECD, the European Commission, and the Government of New Zealand, as well as several UK government departments. He was an advisor to both Barker Reviews of Planning and a board member of the National Housing and Planning Advisory Unit. Most recently, he was a specialist advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on the Built Environment for its inquiry into how to meet the demand for housing. He is an elected fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and of the Weimar School of Advanced Studies in Real Estate and Land Economics. He won the Royal Economic Society's Best Paper Prize for 2004, the European Real Estate Society's Best Paper Prize in 2007, and the EIB ERSA Lifetime Achievement Prize in 2009. He was awarded a CBE for service to economics and housing in 2017. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Paul Cheshire. Just hit the hit that button. Yeah. No. Let's have a look. You might have to just technically just have to click here, but shall I stand there maybe?
This will work, will it?
This should work if you.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me. Very nice to be here. My grandchildren live in Harpenden, so I know the place well. Anyway, this is what I'm going to be talking about. And remember, I'm an economist, so I should be talking about planning and land use as an economist, not as a planner. Because one of the things that we don't think about when we think about planning is that it's actually performing a very, very central economic function. That is, it's allocating a scarce resource, that is land, to every use, but does so without taking any notice of prices. Now, markets allocate scarce resources on the basis of prices, not by fiat or government decision. Planning allocates land on the basis of local political decisions in this country by planning committees. Now, the other thing to note is that property is intrinsically very local. You know, where we grow up in a system, I think I'm probably the only person in this room old enough to have been born and remember the world before Britain had a planning system. That is before 1947. But we've grown up with the system and we just take it for granted as if God had invented it and it's just part of the great British structure. But the reality is, in fact, that the British system of planning is a real outlier in the world. Nearly all advanced countries have a system of land use planning. But the British system, which, poor people, we exported to our former colonies, which is one of the reasons why I was an advisor to the New Zealand government when they were trying to improve their planning system, which they've done. So we exported it to some of our former colonies. I'm not sure about Bangladesh, but we did export it to India. But it's an unusual system. And it's particularly unusual because it's discretionary. All decisions are made on the basis of local political committees, the local planning committee. I think Harpenden is in the district of St Albans, so it's in the St Albans bailiwick. And essentially, politicians make local ad hoc ad hoc decisions. And the other peculiarity of our system is that the control is almost entirely local, not national or regional. If you go, I know a lot about the French system. If you go to France, for example, you have national planning priorities and you have local planning priorities. So local communes in France all make a plan following national sort of template of how to make a plan. And the template has legal requirements on local plan making, and the local plan making process is supposed to be reflected in the national requirements for local planning. So there's a two-way reciprocal but legally obligatory process. Whereas in Britain, essentially, the power is entirely at the local level. Yes, we have a system of appeal. We have the national planning policy framework, which some of you may have heard about, a fairly arcane thing introduced in 2012. Now, I've been closely involved with that, and I would say it's a complete waste of time. It's a complete waste of time because it has no mechanisms for enforcing it. So we're supposed to have a plan-led system. That is, local politicians, in making their decisions, are supposed to be guided by the local plan. So anyone like to guess how many local authorities have got a valid, up-to-date plan?
85%.
Any reduction on 85%? Well, actually, it's less than 30%. So, and there are reasons for this. I'm happy to go into. I mean, it's in the interests of councils that do not want to build houses not to have a plan. Because if they don't have a plan, all the houses that do get built are the result of appeal processes. So they can say it's not us, it's those guys in Whitehall who are forcing us to have houses, the planning inspectorate. So we have a plan-led system that has, I wouldn't say no plans, but has remarkably few plans, and particularly doesn't have plans in southeastern England. That, with the exception of London, London boroughs are very well behaved and almost all have got plans, as has the GLA. And not only have they got plans, but they've got transparent information. You can actually see what their plans are, which you can't if you go to West Dorset or I've never tried to inspect the St Albans plan, but it's remarkably difficult to get coherent and consistent information about what plans are. So that's the sort of outline of our planning system. It's performing an economic function without any economic information in it. And control is entirely local. And what we also observe is that we have a growing housing affordability crisis, and that is central to my talk, if you like, that access to decent housing is getting increasingly out of reach of an increasingly large proportion of our population. The OECD published some data the other day on homelessness. So in Britain, homelessness is not just higher than in any other OECD country, it's about 50% higher than in any other OECD country. We have, I'll go on to, so we have a real problem of access to decent housing. This generates a reduction in our social welfare. It has very adverse distributional effects, and most of us are, I can see, are house owners. I'm a house owner. I've benefited fantastically because I've got a multi-million-pound house. But, you know, my daughter lives in a shoebox which costs more than, you know, she's just a solicitor, and all she can afford is essentially a shoebox. So she comes and works in our house. When she's working from home, she works in our house. So, and the problem, of course, is supply restrictions. If you restrict the supply of something, then the price goes up if demand goes up. And demand for housing, surprise, surprise, has gone up very significantly since 1947. And the real cost of housing has gone up, but the quality of housing has gone down. There are also damaging wider economic effects, because indirectly, the cost of housing, particularly the cost of housing in Southeast England, restricts labour mobility. It makes it very difficult for people in Hartlepool, for example, which is a declining, low-paid economy, to move to, say, Cambridge, where there's lots of jobs and labour shortages because they can't afford the housing. So our housing market and the regional differences in house prices, which I'll show you in a minute, really sort of nail people's feet to the ground in terms of their mobility. Now, because of this, it reduces what are called agglomeration economies. Agglomeration economies are the now well-established fact that people, everything else equal, are more productive in larger cities. And the larger the city is, the more productive they are. Cities don't grow for no reason. They grow because they are, if you like, engines for productivity, and I would say, living in central London, for welfare generation. There are great things to be had in great cities. The other thing that we do with our planning system, which again people don't really think about much, is we directly control where particular activities can locate, even down to the particular sites that they are allowed to build on. And sites selected by local politicians, you may be amazed to discover, are intrinsically less productive than sites chosen by people who are trying to promote their businesses. And there is now good evidence on that. In addition, because there's a restriction on space, the cost of commercial space is higher. So some work I did on the London office, on European housing markets, we included New York in Europe, about 10 years ago, showed that the equivalent tax on building offices in central London averaged about 500% compared to about 50% in New York because of the restriction on supply. That was an article published in the Economic Journal. So a note of explanations. Now, I'm not a free market economist. I'm not saying we should just let it rip and have the free market allocate all land to all uses, because land markets are characterized by endemic problems of what economists call market failure. There are things called public goods. Public goods are things which have no price, and you can't exclude people from benefiting from them. Most common example given when people are teaching elementary economics is defense. You know, if I don't pay my taxes, I still get defended by the army, if that's what I'm looking for. However, actually, they're much more important in land markets. A public park is a public good. How are we going to provide it? Protected landscapes, you know, areas of outstanding natural beauty. Those are public goods. People get benefit from them, but there's no price associated with access to them or enjoying them. So equally, historic townscapes are a public good. You know, Venice is a World Heritage Site for a reason. It's beautiful. Bath is a World Heritage Site for a reason. It's beautiful. We should protect such things because people get benefit from them, and left to itself, the free market would not. Left to itself, because of the cost of housing in London, you'd be building all over Hyde Park and Hampstead Heath. Now that, you know, in my view, would hugely damage welfare because people get enjoyment from that. So we need to have a system that regulates how land is used and provides what economists would call public goods through the land market. But equally, there are externalities. Those are actions which impact on people's welfare, but which are not reflected in prices. A bit different. So, for example, if I'm very fond of very loud music and I live in a town and I play my music at 120 decibels, that will create a negative externality for my neighbors. I don't pay for it. Okay, that's why we have rules to try and control that. But again, land markets have all this because the value that you derive, the welfare you derive from any parcel of land, depends in part on all the surrounding parcels of land. So you enjoy your house if you're a golfer, perhaps, because it's got good access to a golf course. You enjoy having a good supermarket a short walk away. I, living in central London and a fan of Arsenal, enjoy being able to walk to the Emeritus to watch my football. That is an externality, if you like, that's not reflected in prices. And indeed, I used to be an academic at the University of Reading in the days of Concord, and so it can be a long way away. Heathrow, took off from Heathrow, passed over Reading University. I had to stop lecturing because it was so bloody noisy. So I had about 10 minutes every morning that I couldn't talk to the students. That was an externality, but arising from the land use that was nearly 30 miles away. So these externalities can be very important. And again, we need a system of regulation to prevent people from setting up a lead smelting business in a residential area, for example, or an incinerator in a downwind from a residential area. And occasionally, there are also problems of monopoly. If you're trying to build HS2, trying not very hard. If you're trying to build HS2, you have to assemble land. And therefore, those sellers of the last bit of land have a degree of monopoly power, and that may justify compulsory purchase. I'm sure that's a sensitive issue in some areas at the moment. Also, and this is something that I think, as an urban economist, I've taken some time to realize, I think there's also a sort of public good associated with what planners call placemaking. That is, you can design a set of interacting land uses that work well and generate welfare, or you can do it badly. So, the current King's Cross development seems to me a development which generates something more than the sum of its parts. Whereas the old Birmingham bull ring, if any of you remember it, seemed to me one of the least successful urban regeneration that I could think of, a sort of negative placemaking. So yeah, there's a skill which I don't have, but I can recognize exists in designing a community that works better. Therefore, that's another reason we have planning, and that's a private sort of planning, because you have planning consultants who do that. So nearly all advanced countries have a system of planning in order to get around these problems of land markets, but Britain has a very odd system of planning. And it's very odd because it's discretionary and it largely doesn't have plans. So that central to my argument is that the result of this is that we have a crisis of housing affordability. That if we look back over the last 75 years, house prices have doubled more or less in real terms, taking up, allowing for inflation, in every decade since the 1950s. We have this problem of homelessness. We have lots of other problems. It's a major source of inequity, part of my title of my talk, between the old and the young, and that damages social cohesion. Those born in the, I shouldn't have no, it's on my screen, not on that screen. So those who were born in the 1950s, 70% of us owned a house, or you owned a house by the time they were 34. Since 2000, ownership has fallen in that group to 34%. Young people can't afford to buy a house anymore. In addition, there's lost GDP. It reduces labor mobility to more productive areas, so it dampens down the benefits of agglomeration, which are a cost to the whole country. There's been a study done in the United States estimating that, because part of the US in the east and west coast, they have problems similar to us, but not as bad. And it increases the cost of labor in the most productive parts of Britain, in the south and east. So that's a list of some of the problems that arise from having a restriction on supply. It also produces perverse incentives. If we look at land and housing, basically land actually, because it's a land which is restricted, but housing, including the land, has between 1995 and 2015 increased from 49% to 62% of personal assets. So people have a lot of value locked up in their houses. If we look at the whole sort of long period between 1700 and 1960, land and housing in total averaged about the same value as total GDP per annum. Now, since 2010, land and housing has gone to 3 times the value of British GDP. That's from Piketty's study in 2014. If we look at a study of the total returns from all different classes of assets, then again, we find that in the modern era, land and housing has produced a higher rate of return, allowing for capital appreciation, than any other class of asset. Now, the result of increasing the price of land, because it's really land that we restrict the supply of, is that houses are smaller. So modern houses are much smaller. In addition, you have to economize on the design and on the construction quality because so much of the cost goes into the land. And then we also have this issue of a direct hit on productivity. It's not just that we have foregone agglomeration economies. We also have something called town centre first policy, which was introduced in England in 1996. And it's this, which is when we get this evidence of how we lose productivity if we force activities to go onto particular sites. So some research that I published in 2015 showed that the direct result of imposing town centre first policy, which was to require so-called town centre activities, primarily shops, to locate in traditional town centres rather than allow them to decentralise to cheaper land, the cost of that in terms of foregone total productivity was 32%. So there was a 32% loss of total factor productivity in the retail sector. And we did another study looking at the clothing sector, which concluded that the loss in the clothing sector as a direct result of that policy implemented in England was something like 47%. And it's not just in retail that you have this hit. And the cost came partly because the higher cost of land meant the shops were smaller, and everything else equal, a bigger shop is more productive than a smaller shop. Secondly, they came from simply being difficult to build supermarkets in more restrictive areas. We found that the more restrictive a local authority was, the smaller the supermarkets in it were, therefore they were less productive, but also the fewer there were. So that was another big hit. But the main hit seemed to come from the requirement of the planning system selecting sites which were intrinsically less productive, because in retail, the exact location is critical to the productivity of the shop. But that isn't just in retail, it's also in some other activities. For example, we talk about clusters. You think about the media cluster in central London. One of our most productive industries in competitive terms and internationally is the media and the creative arts. They are very tightly clustered in particular locations. So what's happened? This is a graph I'm very fond of because really it tells the whole story. Shows the blue line shows the price of land for housing since the late 19th century, 1892, to 2008. Because in 2008, the last data you can get for land prices, because one of the economy measures that the coalition government introduced in 2010 was to abolish the data collection of land prices. And fast, there was a lot of outcry from people like me, and we did eventually manage to get the data reintroduced, but it was on a different basis and is no longer comparable. So it is available from 2015 again. And the red line is the real cost of housing. So both those take out the effect of inflation. And what you can see is that the cost of housing has increased by about 5-fold, but the cost of land for putting houses on has increased by about 15-fold. But not only that, but you can see from the ups and downs that it's become much more volatile. You get much more booms and busts, because if you restrict supply and demand changes, then the only thing that can change is price. So you get bigger price changes and smaller changes in quantity. So we have very inelastic supply. This is looking at it across the world. This is a percentage increase in real house prices between 1970 and 2021. And the UK, you can see here, no, you can't, right on the right-hand side, I've circled it, the UK, second highest increase in real house prices. And its neighbors, look, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. As I said, we exported our planning system to the poor sods. Germany and Switzerland and France have pretty sensible planning systems. Yeah, you can just about see it. So this is a map of what's called the housing affordability ratio. That's the price of the median house in the district relative to the local residents' median income. So the higher that ratio is, the less affordable houses are in that area. And where we are leaving out Greater London, because clearly houses are expensive in Greater London. Where is the most expensive place in England? You're sitting in it. It's St Albans. Average house prices were 17.6 times average incomes in 2023 in St Albans. The cheapest place in England is still actually quite expensive. It's Burnley at 3.7. The sort of international experts claim that a ratio of 3 means that housing is affordable. So even in Burnley, it's not particularly affordable. And that ratio, of course, has deteriorated fantastically since 2000. So, you know, we're at the epicenter, if you like, of the housing affordability crisis in this country. You may not have often thought about that. But of course, it doesn't make you rich. You live in very expensive houses, but the only way you can benefit from that is by selling up and moving to Burnley. And you probably, I don't want to move, I don't want to sell my house and move to Burnley. I want to stay where I am, where I know and I like it. And I've got friends and relatives. My daughter, as I say, lives around the corner. Grandchildren in Harpenden. I don't want to move a long way away. So it's not really even a tangible liquid asset, but we think of it as being so important in our assets. And the major problem is just a lack of supply. If you look at a simple calculation, in the 30 years to 2019, we built over 3 million fewer houses than we built in the 30 years up to 2090, up to 1990. Another sort of slightly more sophisticated calculation was done by the Centre of Cities, who showed that if we had built houses at the same rate, similar rate to comparable European countries like Germany or France, then we'd have built 4.3 million more houses in the period since 1945 than we have actually built. It was the only country in the OECD where the area of land covered by housing has actually fallen since 2000. And the other thing is we build them in the wrong place. We build them where they are most affordable. So if you compare a representative northern pair of cities, Barnsley and Doncaster, with a prototypical southern pair of cities, Cambridge and Oxford, where you have high wages and productivity and labour shortages. So population in Barnsley and Doncaster since 1980 increased by 23,000, but they built 56,000 new houses. Cambridge and Oxford, the population increased by 95,000, but they only built 29,000 new houses. So in as far as we're building houses, we're tending to build them in what you might call the wrong place. My battery is running low. Can you plug me in? So why is it we can't build houses in this country? Restrictions on the supply of land for housing, and more widely on the supply of housing space. So it's not just that we don't have enough land to put houses on, but because we don't have enough land to put houses on, the houses are too small and people want bigger houses. And it's not just green belts. Green belts have a long, big, important role in this restriction on supply of land, and they cover a very wide area across Britain. But it's also restrictive decisions by councils. Local politicians say no, and they tend to say no more frequently the more unaffordable housing is. So if you look systematically at the proportion of applications which are rejected by the local planning committee, you find it varies from almost 0% up in the north of England to over 50% in many parts in the southeast of England. So there's a big variation in the propensity of local authorities to say no. And we're, again, I'm afraid, more or less in the epicenter of saying no. In addition, because you don't have a rules-based system, you don't have a plan which is then followed, developers don't know what the result of any decision will be. And, building development is a very risky business. I know we don't tend to feel sympathetic to developers, the terrible speculators and whatever, but it's a very risky and, in fact, highly skilled business to do it successfully. Because what you're doing is you're spending a lot of money now for an expected future flow of revenue. A long time in the future, you may be assembling sites and land now, but you're not going to be able to build any houses on it until you've got planning permission, and then you've got to build them, and then you've got to sell them. So that whole process may take 10 years in this country. So you don't know what the future is going to be, but if you also don't know whether you're actually going to be able to be allowed to build houses on the land, because you don't know if you'll get planning permission, that increases the uncertainty, increasing the uncertainty increases the risk, and therefore means that for any particular development to be viable, the expected rate of return has to be even higher than it otherwise would be. So that rules out a lot of potentially useful development proposals. And then we add to that by having Section 106 agreements, where, again, you cannot predict what they will be. Section 106 agreements are these negotiations, if you like, the bribes that developers have to pay to the local planning committee to be allowed to build market housing by including so-called affordable housing within their schemes. And again, the developer doesn't know what that's going to be ahead of time, so it's a negotiation process and there's more uncertainty as a result. And then finally, we sort of crown this achievement of dysfunction by having a local fiscal system that actually penalizes local authorities that allow houses to be built. We achieve that by having funding for local authorities